It all began on Christmas Eve in a small suburban town blanketed with snow. The streets were decorated with twinkling lights, and the smell of gingerbread wafted through the air. In the center of the town stood the mall, a hub of festive activity, complete with a giant Christmas tree and an elaborate Santa Claus display. That night, while families were busy celebrating, for teenagers, Jake, Mia, Ethan, and Lily decided to meet at the mall for some late-night mischief. They weren't there to admire the decorations or buy last-minute gifts. No! They had something else in mind: vandalism. The mall was closed, but that didn't stop them. Using a side entrance that Jake had discovered earlier, they snuck inside, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. Their target? The oversized Santa Claus mannequin at the center of the display. "That thing is creepy as hell," Jake said, pointing to the life-size Santa. Its eyes seemed to glint unnaturally under the dim light, its plastic face frozen in an eerie grin. "Let's make it less creepy," Mia smirked, pulling out a can of spray paint. Within minutes, the teens were defacing the Santa figure, spray painting its face, snapping off its candy cane, and even burning the edges of its velvet coat. They laughed as they worked, oblivious to the faint sound of bells jingling in the distance. As they finished, Ethan noticed something strange. The Santa mannequin's eyes, painted or not, seemed to follow him. He shook his head, blaming it on the dim lighting. "Let's get out of here," Lily said nervously. But before they could leave, a low, raspy sound filled the air. Ho, ho, ho! The laughter was deep, guttural, and came from the direction of the mannequin. The group froze. Did that thing just move?" Mia whispered. "No way," Jake said, though his voice trembled. "It's just the wind or something." But the mannequin's head turned slightly, its painted grin stretching wider. That was enough to send the group running, leaving behind their tools and the desecrated Santa display. The teens thought that was the end of it. They went home, laughing off the strange encounter, chalking it up to paranoia or nerves. But the next day, Christmas morning, something was different. Jake was the first to notice. When he went outside to grab the newspaper, he found something odd on his porch. A small, wrapped gift with a tag that read, "From Santa." Curious, he opened it. Inside was a burnt piece of red velvet, a fragment of the Santa mannequin's coat. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Very funny, guys," he texted the group, assuming it was a prank. But none of them admitted to leaving the gift. Later that day, Mia received a similar package. Inside was a cracked candy cane, just like the one they had broken off the mannequin. Ethan found a piece of blackened plastic shaped like an eye. And Lily? She received a bell, a small, rusted jingle bell that jingled softly even when she wasn't moving it. That night, the group met up to talk about what was happening. They were visibly shaken. "This is getting weird," Lily said, clutching the bell tightly. "Who would go through all this trouble to scare us?" "It's probably some mall worker messing with us," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. As they argued, none of them noticed a figure standing in the shadows outside the window, a tall, broad figure in a tattered red coat, watching silently. One by one, the teenagers began experiencing terrifying events. That night, Jake woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps in his room. He turned on the light, but no one was there. The next morning, he found boot prints in the snow outside his bedroom window, leading away from his house, not toward it. Mia heard the same deep laughter echoing from her attic, though she lived alone. Ethan swore he saw the Santa mannequin standing at the end of his driveway, its hand raised in a mocking wave. And Lily's bell wouldn't stop jingling, even when she locked it away in a drawer. As the days went on, their paranoia grew. They started seeing the same figure everywhere. A man in a red coat with a twisted grin, always just far enough away to be out of reach. He appeared in reflections in the corners of their vision, even in their dreams. They tried to go to the police, but who would believe them? Santa Claus is haunting us. It sounded ridiculous, desperate. They returned to the mall to see if destroying the mannequin would end the nightmare. But when they got there, the display was gone. In its place was a note written in crimson ink. "You've been very naughty this year." That night, the group decided to stick together at Jake's house. Safety in numbers, they thought, but it didn't matter. At exactly midnight, the bells began to jingle. The laughter returned, louder and closer than before. And then the power went out. In the darkness, they heard the sound of heavy boots on the floorboards, moving closer. "Who's there?" Jake shouted, his voice trembling. The reply was chilling. "Ho, ho, ho." A pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the shadows, followed by the hulking figure of Santa. But this wasn't the jolly old man from Christmas stories. His coat was burned and tattered, his face twisted into a horrifying grin, and in his hand was a long, rusted chain. "You think you can destroy Christmas spirit and get away with it?" The figure growled. "Now, it's your turn to pay." What happened next was too horrifying to describe in detail. The teens tried to run, but the figure was always faster, always one step ahead. By morning, their homes were empty. No one ever saw Jake, Mia, Ethan, or Lily again. But if you ever visit that small town during the holidays, you might notice something strange. In the mall's Christmas display, there are now 4 new mannequins, each one eerily resembling the missing teenagers. So, the next time you're tempted to disrespect holiday traditions or mock the festive spirit, remember this story. You never know who or what might be watching. And if you ever hear jingle bells in the middle of the night, you'd better hope you've been good this year. Because Santa doesn't just bring presents, he also brings revenge. It was Christmas Eve in the quiet suburb of Maplewood. The Thompson family, David, his wife Sarah, and their 14-year-old daughter Emma, were celebrating like they did every year. The fire crackled in the living room. The tree sparkled with ornaments, and the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. Everything was perfect until the knock at the door. It was strange, given the hour. The Thompsons weren't expecting visitors. David opened the door and found no one there. But on the porch sat a small, neatly wrapped gift box with a note attached. The note read, in elegant handwriting, asterisk to the Thompson family. "Merry Christmas, asterisk. Who left this?" David muttered, looking around. The street was empty, and fresh snow revealed no footprints. Puzzled, he brought the box inside. "Who's it from?" Sarah asked. "No idea," David replied. "There's no name on it." Emma, excited as any teenager would be about a mysterious gift, urged them to open it. Reluctantly, David tore the wrapping paper. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and scratched, and the pages smelled faintly of mildew. "A diary?" Emma asked, disappointed. "Looks like it," Sarah said, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink faded. Most of the entries were illegible, except for one that caught Sarah's eye. It read, "Asterisk to the one who receives this diary, beware. This is my story and my curse, asterisk." The family exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah set the journal aside, deciding it was probably just a strange prank. But Emma couldn't resist. That night, while her parents slept, she began to read. The first entries in the diary were innocent enough. Written by a young woman named Margaret in the 1800s. She described her life in the same small town of Maplewood, her dreams, and her plans to marry her childhood sweetheart. But as Emma flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Margaret's entries grew darker, describing strange occurrences in her home. Knocks at the door in the middle of the night, whispers coming from empty rooms, and shadows moving where no one should be. Then came the final entry. Asterisk, he's here. The man with no face. He said he would come for me if I told anyone. I don't want to die, but I can't let this curse continue. To whoever finds this, I'm sorry. He'll come for you next. Asterisk. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She slammed the journal shut and decided she'd had enough. But as she turned off her bedside lamp, she thought she heard something. A faint knocking sound coming from downstairs. The next morning, Emma told her parents about the diary. David dismissed it as an old ghost story, but Sarah was more uneasy. That day, strange things began happening around the house. Ornaments fell from the Christmas tree on their own. The fireplace, which had burned steadily all night, went cold and refused to light again. And the faint sound of knocking, always 3 slow, deliberate knocks, could be heard at random intervals. By evening, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Sarah decided to take a closer look at the diary. As she read through Margaret's entries, she noticed something disturbing. The handwriting in the later entries didn't match the earlier ones. It was sharper, more aggressive, almost as if it had been carved into the paper. Then she found it, Margaret's sketch of the man she feared. The drawing showed a tall figure with long, skeletal fingers and a blank, featureless face. Below it, a single sentence was scrawled in red ink. He comes when the gift is opened. Sarah's hands trembled as she shut the journal. David, we need to get rid of this, she said. But when David tried to take the journal outside, the front door wouldn't budge. The locks twisted on their own, sealing the family inside. What's happening? Emma cried, panic setting in. The lights flickered, and the knocking began again, this time louder, echoing through the house. Asterisk 3 knocks, then silence, asterisk, and then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. David grabbed a fireplace poker and shouted, "Who's there?" But no one answered. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the living room. The family huddled together, staring at the doorway. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then a shadow appeared. It stretched across the wall, impossibly tall and thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The shadow's hand rose, pointing toward the journal on the table. Terrified, Sarah grabbed the journal and flipped to the last page. It was blank, but as she stared, words began to appear, written by an invisible hand. Asterisk return what was taken. Only then will it end asterisk. What does that mean? Sarah whispered. Emma, pale and shaking, remembered something from the earlier entries. Margaret mentioned a locket. She said it was taken from her by the man with no face. A locket? David asked. Emma nodded. It must still be in the house. We have to find it. The family split up, searching the house frantically. The knocking grew louder, now coming from every direction. Shadows darted across the walls, and the temperature dropped so low they could see their breath. Finally, in the attic, Emma found it, a small, rusted locket hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She opened it to find a faded photograph of Margaret and a young man. But as Emma held the locket, the shadowy figure appeared behind her, its blank face inches from hers. She screamed, and the figure whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 echoes. Too late. The locket shattered in her hands, and the shadow disappeared. When the family regrouped, they realized the knocking had stopped, and the house was eerily quiet. For a moment, they thought it was over. But when they returned to the living room, the diary was gone. In its place was a new note. You can't escape the last gift. To this day, no one knows what happened to the Thompson family. Neighbors reported seeing their house standing dark and empty, the Christmas lights still twinkling in the windows. Some say the family disappeared without a trace. Others claim they can still hear faint knocking sounds when they walk by. So if you ever find a mysterious gift on your doorstep, think twice before opening it, because not all presents bring joy, and some gifts are meant to be your last. Winter has a way of revealing the darkest secrets, as snow blankets the earth, hiding everything beneath its icy cover. Some things should never be unearthed. What if the frost could hold on to more than just a cold? What if it could trap something much darker? Tonight, I'll tell you a story about an abandoned cabin in the woods, a forgotten soul, and a night that froze more than just the air. This is a haunting tale of the frostbitten soul, a chilling reminder that some places are better left untouched. Make sure you're warm, because this story might just leave you cold to the bone. It started on a frigid December evening. 3 friends, Mark, Claire, and Jason, were on their way to a weekend getaway in the mountains. They had rented a cozy cabin to escape the city and celebrate the holidays. But as they drove deeper into the snow-covered forest, the GPS began to malfunction, leading them down an unmarked road. "This doesn't feel right," Claire said, staring out the window at the towering trees. Their branches, heavy with snow, seemed to arch over the road like skeletal hands. "Relax," Mark replied, gripping the wheel. "It's just a shortcut." Jason, sitting in the back, frowned. Shortcuts don't usually look like scenes from a horror movie. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The car's headlights barely pierced through the swirling snow as the temperature continued to drop. After an hour of driving, they stumbled upon an old, weathered sign, Hollow Creek Cabins. "This must be it," Mark said, relief in his voice. But as they pulled into the clearing, their excitement turned to unease. The cabin wasn't the charming retreat they had imagined. It was dilapidated with broken shutters, a sagging roof, and frost creeping up the windows like icy veins. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Claire asked, shivering. "It's probably just old," Mark said, trying to sound reassuring. "Let's get inside before we freeze." They grabbed their bags and hurried into the cabin. Inside, the air was musty, and the furniture was covered in a thin layer of frost. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, but the logs were damp and useless. As they unpacked, Jason noticed a faded picture hanging on the wall. It showed a family standing in front of the cabin, parents and a little girl. But their expressions were unsettling. The parents looked stern, almost angry, and the girl, her eyes seemed too large, too lifeless. "Creepy," Jason muttered, turning the picture face down on the mantel. That night, the friends huddled together under blankets, the chill seeping into their bones. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the temperature plummeted even further. "We should have gone somewhere tropical," Claire joked, trying to lighten the mood. But no one laughed. There was an oppressive stillness in the cabin, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. At around midnight, Jason decided to go outside for some air. He stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the icy air. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound being the crunch of snow under his boots. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed something strange. A single set of footprints leading away from the cabin. "Mark, did you go out earlier?" he asked when he returned inside. "No," Mark replied. "Claire?" She shook her head, her face pale. The 3 of them exchanged uneasy glances. Jason decided not to mention that the footprints seemed smaller than an adult's, almost childlike. Later that night, Claire woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like a breeze carrying a voice. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Mark? Jason?" she called out. No one answered. The whispering grew louder, coming from outside her window. Summoning her courage, Claire peeked through the frosted glass. At first, she saw nothing but snow. But then, in the distance, she spotted a figure, a little girl in a tattered dress, standing barefoot in the snow. Claire gasped and blinked, but when she looked again, the girl was gone. The next morning, Claire told the others about what she had seen. Mark dismissed it as a dream, but Jason looked uneasy. What if it's the girl from that picture? He suggested. Mark laughed nervously. Come on, it's just an old photo. There's no way. Before he could finish, the firewood Claire had stacked the night before fell from the mantel. The logs rolled onto the floor, forming the shape of a crude arrow pointing toward the front door. Okay, that's weird, Mark admitted. As the day went on, more strange things happened. Their phones, fully charged that morning, all died simultaneously. The windows began to frost over completely, blocking out the sunlight, and the whispering, it followed them, growing louder and more insistent, though they could never find its source. By nightfall, the friends were terrified. Mark tried to start the car, but it wouldn't even turn over. We're trapped here, Jason said grimly. Claire clutched her blanket, staring at the picture on the mantel. Somehow, it had turned itself upright again, and now, the girl in the photo seemed to be smiling. That night, the temperature in the cabin dropped to an unbearable level. Their breaths came out in clouds, and frost began to coat the walls. The whispering turned into a low wail, echoing through the cabin. What does she want? Claire cried, tears freezing on her cheeks. Jason, clutching a flashlight, pointed to the picture. The diary mentioned a girl named Eliza. She froze to death here years ago. Why is she haunting us? Mark shouted. Because she's alone, Jason whispered. At that moment, the wailing stopped. A deafening silence filled the room, and then the door burst open. Snow swirled inside, and in its midst stood the figure of a little girl. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and frost clung to her hair like a crown. You came to my home, she whispered, her voice like the wind. Now you'll never leave. The friends screamed as the temperature dropped even further. Frost crept over their skin, their breath slowing as they began to freeze. The last thing Claire saw was Eliza's icy smile, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Days later, hikers discovered the cabin. Inside, everything was frozen solid. The furniture, the walls, even the air felt unnaturally cold. But there was no sign of the three friends. However, a new picture now hung on the mantel, one showing Mark, Claire, and Jason standing in front of the cabin. Their faces were blank, their eyes lifeless. So, if you ever find yourself lost in the woods and stumble upon an old cabin, think twice before stepping inside. Because sometimes the cold doesn't just freeze your body, it steals your soul.